Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the fourth week of 2014. For almost a quarter century, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Karen Aram and Ron Zook. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently, and then having our colleagues comment on them. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20-plus years we've been on the air. Chomsky has said in the American media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Today is January 24th, a day of tyranny tempered by assassination. I used to think that phrase came from Gibbon, but I went looking for it and found that in fact it's a 19th century phrase, it's useful and perhaps says something about why it was coined in the 19th century. But on this day in AD 41, the Roman Emperor Caligula, Little Boots is what it means in Latin, known for his eccentricity and cruel despotism, is assassinated by his disgruntled Praetorian guards. The guard then proclaimed Caligula's uncle, Claudius, as emperor. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a Greek historian of the previous generation, who flourished under the reign of Caesar Augustus, is responsible for the remark that history is philosophy teaching by example. And Chomsky, by the way, our own mentor, remarked a number of years ago, there's a good reason why nobody studies history. It just teaches you too much. And I think there's a good bit to this. Also on this day in the year AD 1961, a United States bomber carrying 2 H-bombs broke up in midair over North Carolina. The uranium core of both bombs did not detonate, although apparently it's a fairly near-run thing, but the uranium core of one bomb was never found. So if you're in North Carolina and poking around in old military hardware, hey, be careful.
What's that in the bottom of the swimming pool?
Fukushima, is that? Yeah, right.
Fukushima, yeah.
5 years ago yesterday, in fact, a CIA drone flattened a house in Pakistan's tribal regions. It was the third day of Barack Obama's presidency, and this was the new commander-in-chief's first covert drone strike. Initial reports said up to 10 militants were killed, including foreign fighters and possibly a high-value target, a successful first hit for the fledgling administration. Now, normally they don't announce this, but they allowed that story to be leaked on Obama's initial killing spree. But later, reports of civilian casualties began to emerge. The strike was far from a success. At least 9 civilians died, most of them from one family. One member of the family survived, a 14-year-old who's still around and talking about what his family suffered, but he's missing an eye and various pieces of his body from the American drone. Later that same day, 5 years ago, the CIA attacked again, or Barack Obama attacked again, and leveled another house, and it was another mistake. This time one that killed between 5 and 10 people, all civilians. Obama was briefed, as they say, on the civilian casualties and was, quote, understandably disturbed, close quote, according to the account that the White House released to Newsweek. 3 days later, in his inauguration address, Obama told the world that, quote, America is a friend of each nation and every man, woman, and child who seeks a future of peace and dignity, close quote, unless you happen to be targeted on a Terror Tuesday by President Obama. Obama himself has launched over 390 covert drone strikes in the first 5 years in office, killing at least 2,500 people, perhaps twice that, including 200 children. I think of Horatio's lines, give order that these bodies high on a stage be placed to the view, and let me speak to the yet unknowing world how these things came about. So shall you hear of carnal, bloody, and unnatural acts, of accidental judgments, casual slaughters, of deaths put on by cunning and forced cause, and in this upshot, purposes mistook fallen on the inventors' heads. All this can I truly deliver. You're watching news from Neptune, a casual slaughter edition. And we'll start with Ron Zook. What stories do you think were ignored or misreported this week, Ron?
Well, these have not been actually ignored. You can find them in standard mainstream media sources for the most part.
But you have to look, right?
Yeah, but you have to look, know where to look, and know what to discount. Another story, for example, in this morning's News Gazette about how the rich deserve their riches because of their hard work and so on. Mm-hmm. And it's just amazing how frequently these stories appear.
This one not written by David Brooks?
No.
Like somebody else?
No. Elizabeth, what's her name? Sapita or something?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and it's amazing. So the standard line is poor people are poor because they are lazy, right. Or in Brooks's line, they are a bad character, they make bad decisions, right. And they should get married and get a job and work hard and get more education and so on. Right. And he's willing to contemplate the government helping him a little in that respect, unlike a lot of the really far out right people. But anyway, my theme today is the same as usual, the two nations, the rich and the poor. And so I'm wearing one of my silly hats again today to increase our viewership, drive it up maybe from 3 to 5 or something.
Ron.
So, as people can gossip about how crazy I am and so on. I'm spreading organic matter everywhere. But okay, the theme today is, again, well, basically class conflict, but we can't talk about that. So the rich and the poor. In November, it was reported, revised census measure, the nation's poor at 49.7 million, higher than the official count. Mm-hmm. The old way of counting the statistics of who's poor is obsolete, according to a number of economists. And this says the number of poor people in America is 3 million higher than the official count, encompassing 1 in 6 residents due to out-of-pocket medical costs and work-related expenses, according to a revised census measure released Wednesday, one that's endorsed by a lot of economists. It's aimed at providing, this new measure is aimed at providing a fuller picture of poverty, but does not replace the official government numbers, which will continue to be used. The latest numbers come as more working-age adults picked up low-wage jobs in the slowly improving economy, but still struggled to pay living expenses. So the big problem, some say, is that many people who have jobs, it's really stupid and silly to yell at them, get a job, because they have jobs, they just don't pay enough to live on. Okay. And there are a lot of these people in the so-called precariat who are Walmart clerks or people who work the counter and the back room at McDonald's and so on. And there's a gathering problem there, but a lot of people don't seem to want to deal with it. They have jobs. So they keep referring to the poor as the undeserving poor, and they're very moralistic about it. And I think it's time to get over that, but we'll see. Survey, January 17th. Consumer sentiment dips on lower and middle class income despair. U.S. consumer sentiment dipped in its first January measure, weighed by lowered expectations among lower and middle class, lower and middle income families, a survey released on Friday showed. The Thomson Reuters University of Michigan preliminary reading on the overall index and consumer sentiment came in at 80.4, down from 82.5 in December. This says upper income households benefited from continued strong gains in income as well as increases in stock and home values. Survey Director Richard Curtin said in a statement, lower and middle income households were mainly concerned about lackluster growth in employment and income and anticipated less improvement in long-term prospects for the economy. Increasing number of people view themselves as poor. They call themselves poor, which for a long time wasn't true. People didn't think that they were poor, didn't refer to themselves that way. Meanwhile, a study by Oxfam's Global Inequality Study, this says the report that everybody's talking about, well, I discount that, but we're going to talk about it for a minute, which leads with an eye-popping statistics. The richest 85 people in the world own more wealth than the bottom half of the entire global population. Before we dig into the document, a programming note about inequality. Wealth isn't income, salary is income, but investments, stocks, houses, or equity in a business build wealth. Wealth comes from money.
I think that's the 85 calling. I tell you to stop talking about them that way, huh?
Yeah.
I mean,
wealth comes from money
them.
you don't immediately spend. Since poor people spend more of their income immediately, the rich people save and invest more of their income immediately. It's predictable that wealth inequality will be much worse than income inequality.
Yes, good point.
So there are some accompanying graphs here. The percentage increase on share of income of the richest 1%, the United States is at the top of the list, followed by Australia and Sweden. Near the bottom are Denmark, Spain, and France. So the share of the national income going to the richest 1%, highest in the United States, next on the list Singapore, then Ireland. At the bottom, New Zealand, Mauritius, Sweden, and Denmark. Some of that is a little surprising. The world poverty rate is falling, and yet there are more and more people in poverty, which may seem paradoxical again, but there's an explanation if you care to follow it.
Wealth is concentrating at the top.
Yes. Another note. This morning, fined billions, J.P. Morgan Chase will give Dimon a raise. A year after an embarrassing trading blow-up led to millions of dollars of being docked from Jamie Dimon's paycheck, the chairman and chief executive of J.P. Morgan Chase is getting a raise. J.P. Morgan's board voted this week to increase Mr. Dimon's annual compensation for 2013, hashing out a pay package after a series of meetings that turned heated at times, according to several executives. The details were not made public, but Mr. Dimon's compensation, having been cut in half a year ago to $11.5 million. When they made that deep pay cut, the board was giving a stern rebuke over the fallout from the London whale multi-billion-dollar trading blunder. This week, directors gathered at a conference room in the bank's Park Avenue headquarters, overlooking a snow-covered Central Park, discussed what message the next decision on the bank chieftain's compensation will send. What message are we sending, right? The debate pitted a vocal minority of directors who wanted to keep his compensation largely flat, citing the approximately $20 billion in penalties J.P. Morgan has paid in the last year to federal authorities, against directors who argued that Mr. Dimon should be rewarded for his stewardship of the bank during such a difficult period. Amazing vagueness, whatever, of what that was. But during the meetings, some board members left the conference room to pace up and down the 50th floor corridor. and so on. So details will be disclosed later, but so what if they've been fined millions of dollars by the government for illegal activity? Once again, nobody has gone to jail, and banks have paid some big fines, but they look big to you and me,
Exactly.
amounting to millions of dollars, but they're completely insignificant in view of the total bank wealth and income. Meanwhile, a new trend in hotels. $28,000 a night. Hotels race to cater to the super rich. And here we're talking not necessarily about the 1%, but the 1% of the 1%.
Right, right.
In most hotels, luxury is measured by the thread count of the linens, minimum 400 please, or the brand of bathroom toiletries. But for those at the highest end of the market, where the only strain on consumption is how conspicuous they want to be, a race to the top is broken out, with hotels outdoing one another to serve this tiny, if highly visible, niche. Take the Jewel Suite by Martin Katz in the New York Palace, one of two recently opened specialty suites. The three-story, 5,000 square foot space, a sort of penthouse Versailles, itself resembles a jewel box, albeit one with its own private elevator and views of the Empire State and Chrysler buildings. So this goes on to describe the luxury appointments in this hotel suite. The question is, why do people go for this? Why do hotels continue to build and maintain these super luxurious suites? One marketing expert says it's a matter of other brands trying to pay catch up to that. They don't want to be the only hotel on the block that doesn't have this super high-end offering. In New York, the race to capture the highest end of the market continues. In November, the Mandarin Oriental in New York opened a 3,300 square foot suite that includes floor-to-ceiling windows and a dining room that seats 10. Its rate is $28,000 a night. And so on and on. These boutique hotels, which are opening in Asia and a number of other places around the world. They also indirectly attract a middle-class aspirational traveler. It is the attention, the halo effect, doing a suite like this brings, he said. Even if they'll never be able to drop the cost of a new compact car on a night's stay in a hotel, some travelers want to brush elbows with that level of wealth. Mm-hmm. Just imagine how ecstatic it is to be in the same room with these super wealthy people, very high...
Hinwees.
Yeah, high-income individuals.
High net worth individuals,
right.
Yes, right.
The income stratification is more dramatic. That brings this on, he said. That's what we're really talking about. Highly conspicuous consumption that we heard about from Thorsten Veblen many years ago, over a century ago, and it's coming back. So that's my concern for today, and I'll come back and make some more sarcastic comments if someone wants to question me about it. Meanwhile, I refer you to recent columns by Bill Moyers and by Paul Krugman on the undeserving rich and what is happening to our society, the division, the ever-increasing gulf between the rich, not only the rich, but the very, very rich, and the rest of us. So there it is.
Thank you, Ron. Comments on that, Karen?
Well, what kind of comment can I make? I mean, $11 million is what Jamie Dimon is currently earning and not happy with.
Well, that's just base salary now. We're not talking about
base salary,
compensation.
Right,
yeah.
right, and that was cut in half from what he had been earning, so he's not happy. And I have to ask, I mean, how many homes does one person need? Okay, even if you have a dozen children and a huge extended family, think of all the huge palatial palaces you can purchase, the yachts. I mean, the houses that contain bowling alleys, I mean, soccer fields and swimming pools in the backyard. How many of those does one person need? How many Mercedes-Benzes does one person need? It boggles my mind that these people have I hate to say it, such low self-esteem, that's the way I would like to label it, that they have to possess so much material wealth to prove their worth.
Oh, you're just envious.
Yes. That's what some would say.
That's the line. Right.
I'm not. I like nice things. I like pretty things. I consider myself materialistic. But it's like, how much does anyone need? Like, I was thinking food. Like, I love food, okay? I like to eat a lot of food. But if we see a person walking down the street that's really heavy or too large, we immediately assume that he's overconsumed and refer to him as, that's rather piggish. But yet some of these 1% people with their millions, if they had consumed the amount of money they have, they would be as large as the Empire State Building, if that was at all humanly possible. And yet we'd all sit back and revere them somehow, that somehow their overconsumption is not to be... We'll point at the little guy, okay?
It's become notorious that poor people
Yes.
are much more often obese than rich people.
Well, right. Poor diet, lack of opportunity. There are a lot of reasons for that. But that's what I'm saying. We vilify the guy who's overweight, but we don't vilify the people who have so overconsumed resources and possess so much wealth. So, anyway.
I think there's some interesting straws in the wind right now about the extent to which the world economic elite, the super rich, that fraction of 1% you were talking about, Ron, are worried about the fact that the growing criticism of the economy that they preside over may actually lead to real trouble. And there are peculiar ways in which they're trying to cover it. The one that I noticed this week, a number of the best restaurants in the world that go into the Michelin Guide, a worldwide list of restaurants where restaurants are given stars for their excellent, 5 stars being the top, even 1 Michelin star being the sign of an outstanding restaurant according to the guide. That a number of restaurants in various places, both Europe and Asia, I don't know whether any U.S. restaurants were involved, were asking Michelin to reassess them and lower their star rating. The reason being that Chinese dignitaries have trouble going to a 5-star restaurant and then explaining their expense account at home, basically to the Chinese people, the notion that the Chinese authorities, members of an officially communist party, are dining at a 5-star restaurant is embarrassing to the folks at home. Therefore, these restaurants would like to have their star rating lessened so the Chinese dignitaries can still come there, but it won't be said they went to a 5-star restaurant. Now, when we've reached a system like that, it seems to me that there's some suggestion that the elites are worried. I think you could find other examples in this country as well, and I think it's true. I think the popular outrage in the United States and in Europe to the austerity programs of European and American governments is producing a reaction. And the Obama administration is worried about having to control popular demonstrations, popular outbreaks this spring. I think we may even hear an attempt to pour oil on those particular troubled waters, at least metaphorical oil, from Mr. Obama next Tuesday night when the State of the Union message is delivered to a still unknowing world. I think they're worried. And I think they have good reason to be worried. And their response is not doing what's necessary to calm the economic distress of those troubled waters, but rather to keep the lid on. This morning's column by Paul Krugman in the Times begins with a quotation from John Maynard Keynes from 1936 that's remarkably appropriate for our current situation. In 36, Lord Keynes wrote, "The outstanding faults of the economic society in which we live are its failure to provide for full employment and its arbitrary and inequitable distribution of wealth and incomes." Close quote. That's Keynes in 1936. Karen, you mentioned a few minutes ago that in the celebration of Martin Luther King last week, what was not mentioned so often was King's insistence that the only way you deal with poverty in America is by establishing a guaranteed annual income. Now, people who talked about King didn't talk about the establishment of a guaranteed annual income when they talked about all the wonderful progress that's been made in civil rights since King's time, if indeed there is any of it. But it's indeed these questions we should be talking about, and I think our rulers are worried that we are talking about them to the extent we are. You're watching News from Neptune. We will take up these questions in various ways in future, I'm sure. Karen, what's on your list of things neglected or misreported this week?
I didn't really come with a list, but after I do flip through the news media on TV regularly, because my concern, of course, is number one, the bill S-1881, which is to impose more sanctions on Iran.
And to scuttle the talks with Iran.
Totally
yeah,
scuttle
right,
the peace talks with Iran, yes.
Exactly.
Yes, that's number one. Number two is also the TPP.
Oh, yes.
Did I get the letters right? Yes. This is coming around, I guess, in another couple weeks for a vote. And I don't think the impact on people worldwide, especially the poor, can be minimized in any way. I think it's going to have horrible, horrible impact. They referred to it as NAFTA on steroids. So I didn't bring any information on this. We have discussed it previously, but I would hope that two of you gentlemen who are better informed on the details than I might want to go over that briefly. I didn't see anything on mainstream media. Their focus was on Hillary's running for president.
Oh, good heavens.
And something else. Oh, yes, and this Virginia former governor who's being accused of fraud. And, okay, right. And every time I'd switch stations, that's the kind of thing I would get.
But the Trans-Pacific Partnership that's being negotiated right now by the Obama administration in absolute secrecy, except for leaks, is exactly what you describe. I mean, it's a horrendous piece of work that's marketed, so to speak, as a free trade pact.
Right.
What in fact it is a corporate rights and investors' rights pact that will override public attempts to control the actions of corporations and the control of trade that they enforce throughout the Pacific region. It's a big deal. It's an important deal. And its importance is shown by the silence the administration has tried to maintain about the matter, the secrecy the administration has tried to maintain on it. There's a clear example of the Obama administration working for its real masters, that fraction of the 1%, and not wanting other people to know about it, like those restaurants that didn't want the Chinese populace to know where their officials were eating.
Right.
This is the Obama administration doesn't want to let people know where they're dining in the Pacific and whom they're eating in the Pacific. The most immediate form of it is the debate, such as it is an attempt in Congress to pass a fast-track arrangement. Fast-track is a parliamentary arrangement that in the Congress that allows treaties like the Trans-Pacific Partnership to be voted up or down, but not amended and not challenged in the Congress. Now, in order to avoid any difficulties about what the treaty actually includes, without even having to admit what the treaty actually includes. So the first step is to establish this legislative procedure whereby the vote is up or down and there is no discussion or amendment of this. Now, that can be stopped, and there is an attempt to stop it right now, to stop the fast track, to make Congress, in fact, reveal what the treaty includes, in fact, reveal to Congress what the treaty includes, and discuss and amend it. So this is something we should certainly be aware of. We should write your representatives in Congress pointing out that fast track authority is quite opposite to the public interest here, as is the Trans-Pacific Partnership itself. So that's where we start.
I don't know all the details, but the talk that's been emerging about the TPP is that it grants a privileged status to the transnational corporations.
Exactly.
It will remove the ability of ordinary people to sue these corporations for ignoring labor standards and environmental regulations and so on, and making them practically immune to anything that ordinary people can do to bring consumer suits against them and so on. So it is said that it will enable these transnational corporations to override essentially the Constitution, American law, and so on. They become a regime into themselves, and will acquire a kind of international status, a sovereignty that is not available to any actual historic nation.
And if there's any doubt about whom the Obama administration is working for, we should observe how important this TPP is to the Obama administration, how much they worked on it, how much it's a part of their general procedure. They are also working on a similar arrangement with Europe, an agreement with the EU that would have the same characteristics that Ron just described for corporate rights, investor rights, and so forth in involvement with the European Union, economic involvement with the European Union. Now, and if we want any background of this, we should look back at the passage of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, as it was called, in the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration worked very hard for it, as the Obama administration is working very hard for the Pacific and European agreements. Now, the NAFTA was presented as a free trade pact, even in the name, and it was much more what Ron just described. Now, we've seen how NAFTA has worked in the last 20 years. There shouldn't be any doubt about what the TPP or the European agreement would do. One of the things, of course, is done is destroyed, NAFTA has done, is destroyed Mexican agriculture, which was obvious to the Clinton administration, so obvious that along with NAFTA, they militarized the southern border of the United States, knowing that there would be an influx of impoverished people coming from Mexico into the United States because of the destruction of Mexican agriculture occasioned by the influx of North American crops that were government subsidized under NAFTA. Now, that's what's happened. You know, how many stories have you read about Mexican drug cartels? The drug cartels come not as a result of a healthy economy, but of an economy in which they're the only way to make money. This is a direct result of American international economic operations, and the TPP and the agreement with Europe are further examples of it. We can't claim ignorance about what they'll produce.
Why do so many Mexicans and Guatemalans want to come north and into the USA? It's a matter of survival for them. They have been crowded out of the Mexican economy. They typically grew some corn and beans, a kind of subsistence economy, and maybe a little bit more to sell for money. A money economy has not really completely pervaded Mexico, especially southern Mexico. and that was their way of survival. But with the influx of North American products, the corn, which Mexicans could then buy cheaper than they could buy Mexican-grown corn, it left these people without a livelihood, and the only alternative they saw was to go north and to cross the border and try to find something in the USA that would keep them alive.
The last thing I read on recently on the TPP is that China was interested in joining and signing into this, but I don't think I think they've been rebuked so far.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, this is clearly part of the economic contest with China that the U.S. government is quite consciously engaged in, is working very hard on, and is central to U.S. foreign policy. I mean, we've known that for years the American concern for the Middle East is based on the fact that the U.S. insists upon controlling the oil flows from the Middle East, many of which do go to Asia. China and Japan need oil from the Middle East, and the U.S. is bound and determined to control where it gets it, where they get it. And that doesn't begin with the Obama administration by any means. It begins after the Second World War, but the Obama administration is extremely active in the attempt to control those oil flows, and that's the source of the concern with Iran that is motivating the Obama administration at the moment, and underlies the supposed peace conference going on in Switzerland regarding Syria. I mean, there's an old SDS mantra: everything is connected. You know, well, when you begin to talk about the wealth of the international elite and the American attempt to control the international economy, everything is connected. Yeah. There's no doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've discovered this step by step, going through the process, seeing the interconnection just continue.
And this produces some peculiar, very peculiar actions on the part of political players in the U.S. and elsewhere. I thought one of the most peculiar ones from this past week was a pair of editorials in the New York Times and the Washington Post calling upon President Obama to use the threat of U.S. bombing in order to produce a favorable outcome from the talks about Syria in Switzerland. The Washington Post, and I'm quoting here, could force a diplomatic agreement for a transition government in Syria by presenting Mr. Assad, oh, that's nice, with the choice of accepting them or enduring U.S. airstrikes. Now, that's the Washington Post saying, you know, we've got to threaten to bomb Syria if we want to get anything done in this peace conference in Switzerland. The New York Times said the same thing. Now, these are the elite liberal newspapers, but their true colors are demonstrated here, it seems to me, in showing that what the U.S. is really worried about, really concerned about in the Middle East, is the sort of control that is provided essentially by military force. That's the way the U.S. has controlled the Middle East since the years after the Second World War. Nothing has changed. But it's just a little odd to see the elite newspapers, the opinion formers, step forward and say, hey, look, this is serious. We've got to start killing people in order to do it right. And Mr. Obama, you better not hang back on this matter. I think that testifies to what is shaping up, I think, to have been one of the most important political events of this past year. And that was the inability of the Obama administration to bomb Syria when they thought they had constructed a situation in which they would be able to use that overwhelming military force. They were stopped from doing it essentially by an outcry by the American people. We began today's show by talking about the extent to which Americans are ready to object to the economic conditions, the austerity provided by the Obama administration. I think Americans are also ready to protest against the use of war and rumors of war as a way to distract people from that. This was unprecedented, this stopping of the administration's plan to bomb Syria. They didn't expect it. And I think even the Americans who rose up and complained about it didn't expect it either. If we could compare it to anything at all, it might be to the rejection by the Congress of the TARP plan at the outbreak of the financial crisis in 2007. Now that had to be reworked by the administration going back to the Congress and saying, look, you didn't manage to pass this once, so try again. And this time, they managed to pass it. Now, it seems to me that the call from the New York Times and the Washington Post for bombing Syria looks like that transferred to the military sphere. I hope they're not successful.
What about the coming crisis over bombing Iran? This is interesting, the way it's going. First, Senator Menendez, the primary sponsor of this, is now under federal investigation for other kinds of crimes. Senators Warren and who's the other one? Patty Murray have come out against it.
Are you referring to S-1881
yes,
bill?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
the one that essentially says we're going to start bombing Iran if they don't immediately start obeying us, and saying that if Israel decides to bomb them, go to war with them, that we will have to immediately do likewise. So it's an amazing document.
It really
is. When you read it,
yeah.
it puts whether we will go to war, when and how, into the hands of the Israeli government. We will no longer decide that for them ourselves.
Right.
They will decide for us when we go to war with Iran, which is just amazing. Do people understand the implications of that?
That's right. I don't think the majority of people out there, they're so bogged down with so many other things that if you mention this bill to them, most of them are. And I think that's the problem with media, is the constant distractions and bombarding people with information. And that's what I think we attempt to do, is to try to, look at what's essential where we are.
And I think it also testifies to the extent to which an absolutely false narrative about what's going on in the Middle East and what the U.S. is doing in foreign policy is the basis of the discussion as it continues. It's a fantasy that the U.S. has got to stop Iran from its desperate attempt to produce a nuclear weapon. First of all, Iran is not producing a nuclear weapon.
Right.
Even American intelligence agencies agree. Secondly, even if Iran were to produce a nuclear weapon, there is the problem that other countries have literally hundreds of nuclear weapons surrounding them. But there's more to this, and to try to give a clear account of why the U.S. and Israel are behaving as they are vis-a-vis Iran leads us back to the economic conditions we were talking about a moment ago, specifically the control of oil. The U.S. recognizes, anyone who looks at the situation recognizes, that if the Iranians were to produce a nuclear weapon, which they aren't, it would be a defensive weapon. It would be the reason the U.S. Didn't attack North Korea when it attacked Iraq. It would be a weapon that would allow the Iranians to hold off the Israeli and U.S. threats by saying, look, if you attack Iran, we have a weapon that could be used against Tel Aviv. So it's defensive in that sense. And as a defensive weapon, there's an argument for it. Plus the fact that everything that Iran has done seems to be legal under the U.S.-sponsored Non-Proliferation Treaty. So what the U.S. is actually doing here, and using Israel as its stalking horse in some ways, what the U.S. is doing here is it's a generation-old attempt to exert control over Iranian oil. The Iranians got out from under American control in 1979, and we've never forgiven them for that. And we intend to reintroduce the circumstances that we first introduced with a CIA coup more than 60 years ago. Now, this situation is not being explained to Americans.
Right.
All Americans hear is that, oh, the mad mullahs,
Right.
I'm quoting President Obama there, the mad mullahs might get a nuclear weapon, and they've got to be stopped because that would be really dangerous if they got a nuclear weapon. Now, when the discussion is conducted at that level, when the real interests, the real goals, the real policies of the U.S. and Israel are not talked about, it's hardly surprising that we don't have Americans know much about it. We don't find that Americans know much about it. It's all the more remarkable that things like the popular uprising that prevented the bombing of Syria can occur. And the only thing we can hope is that this sort of thing can be prolonged, this can be continued, and the administration's lies and prevarications about what it's doing in the Middle East can be further exposed, and Americans can object to it, as indeed they do.
Yeah, there are some crazy doctrines circulating about this. One being, in effect, that the Iranians are so insanely doctrinaire and fanatical that they will bomb Israel if they get a atomic bomb. And there's no reason to think that. They're not that completely irrational and insane, because they know what the consequences of that would be. So where is this craziness coming from about the Iranian and nukes? I don't get it, but there's a lot of effort, time, money being poured into convincing us that this is a terrible thing, a threat to the USA, and so on, and therefore we will have to start bombing them whenever we feel threatened, or when Israel does. And it's utterly crazy. It's interesting to me that what we might call the Bush Doctrine has taken over our thinking. Internationally, it's if we feel threatened by Iraq acquiring weapons of mass destruction, which we find out they didn't, but that's our reason for bombing them, going to war with them, and conquering Iraq. It also appears at a micro level, at the personal level. The stand your ground law in Florida. If I feel threatened, if I feel in danger and even uncomfortable, it's my right to defend myself, pull out my gun, and blow away this person who makes me feel threatened.
Exactly.
And this is utterly crazy, but it's taken over the thinking of a lot of people, and both the macro and micro versions, I would call them.
That's very good, because that's exactly what I see.
Yeah.
I see that the micro version is really supporting the macro version.
Yes.
And so it's very difficult to talk to someone. Now, I've made the point I will not carry a gun, even if everybody else in Illinois is carrying a gun, because either one, I might use it. They know that shooting people tends to be an impulse.
Yeah, it's very
just
impulsive.
as suicide. Suicide is an impulse.
Yes.
Or it'll just accidentally go off, and I'm very capable of doing that. So I will not carry a gun. I don't want to shoot anybody. But the same, so, people take the attitude, but you have to have a gun to protect yourself. And so they use this rationale that, well, I felt threatened, and they kill innocent people.
Yeah.
So then they look at Iran and they're like, oh, well, we don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon, even though Iran is surrounded by nuclear weapons,
Yes.
especially by the Israelis. And anyone just looking at Iraq today, look what we did to Iraq, because they didn't have nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't defend themselves against, So Iran would be nuts if they didn't want to possess a nuclear
Yes.
weapon.
Yes.
That's my thinking on it.
So to use some of the standard cant, again, does Iran have a right to defend itself? has as much right as
Yeah,
anyone else
it's a
does.
deterrent.
But
It's
what
a
are the
deterrent.
implications of that? Does that mean that we have the right to decide what weapons they will be allowed to have?
No.
I think you're right too to suggest that there is a sort of trade-off between the national political mythology and how we're dealing in a dangerous world, et cetera, the sort of nonsense we'll hear from Mr. Obama on Tuesday night, and what's happening on the local level. And that's bound up with the very real distress that people have in their lives economically. And the examples you all give, I think, are quite right. But there is a general effect in the militarization of American police in the years since the beginning of the War on Terror.
Yes.
And some of that is directly aided by the Pentagon providing the weapons often that were used in the Middle East or designed for the Middle East, to local police forces, and so now we have these police forces that are militarized and look exactly like military units, not like the old style.
Yeah, they're
old style
buying
police.
military surplus armored personnel characters, and even tanks in some
They're
cases.
being given them by the Pentagon. That's right. I remember years ago when I first came to Champaign, the Champaign police were responsible for killing a citizen who was simply not responding to the commands of the local police. They choked him to death. And the city council responded by buying the police a tank. Now, this
Are you
was
serious?
This was 15 years ago. I mean, that's the case. You can find the case in the newspaper files and so forth. But I mean, at the time, that seemed odd. Now, in the following 15 years, police forces, including our local police forces, have acquired other tanks and, as Ron says, military weapons at a great level. They need them for the war on drugs, you see. They don't want to be outgunned by the drug dealers. Well, there's another way to get rid of that, and that, of course, is to end the war on drugs and decriminalize drugs and stop this notion that there is a Mexican-style war going on between drug cartels and police. But, of course, police forces don't want to do that. They want to be heavily armed and see themselves as defenders of the right over against all those dangerous things out there. Fear as a motivation for American politics goes back a long way, back to Indians and slaves, and the fear of the sorts of things that we might have to confront if we don't have our guns. And this is the modern version of that. I remember I don't know why I'm having these flashbacks at the moment, but I remember years ago in New Haven, the chief of police of New Haven saying that his biggest problem, and this was a generation ago, his biggest problem was keeping suburban white adventure seekers off the force. That is, he meant to say that the people who wanted to be police in New Haven, which is in fact a remarkably divided community, the two nations are present in New Haven, Connecticut, up front and personal. But the problem was to prove, he thought, and suggesting he was quite correct, the problem was keeping folks who wanted to fight that particular war off his police force. Well, I don't think they've been successful in doing that across the country, and I think the international situation, the international politics of the United States has simply encouraged this attitude.
Yeah, this has some paradoxical results. Some have pointed out that in response to school shootings, now, instead of sending out 1 or 2 officers to deal with the situation, which they ordinarily would be able to do very quickly, and because they can get there in just a few minutes, now it's becoming typical to send in 20 or 30 very heavily armed people on a SWAT team.
Exactly.
And looking like a military operation.
And one of those tanks.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And again, it's just crazy. It's a wild overreaction. Why are they doing it? Because they can.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that I know that the sheriff of Champaign has a drone, and they claim that they use it to find people lost or something, missing, whatever. But it's, anyway, another toy. What I was going to say is about the Tom Hartman show this morning on UPTV. He was talking briefly about the police department and how we need to recognize them as professionals. They need proper training and education. They need to be paid as professionals, and maybe this is a way we can demilitarize them, because they have been so militarized, what with all the beatings and killings that are taking place across the nation by our police of primarily young African American men, most of the time, for nothing, for no reason whatsoever. That is the one thing I do pick up on the regular media, is often a picture of a young man being beaten and terribly, and they've actually got films of some of them where there's absolutely no reason for it.
On the international level, or the national level in terms of what the United States is doing, there is a dimension of this that, in fact, is not being written about very much, except by a few intrepid reporters. It turns up in the film Dirty Wars, and that is the private army that the Obama administration is running around the world. It grows out of a number of things, and going back indeed to the Carter administration and their attempt to rescue hostages in Iran. So it has a remote source that has now produced a Praetorian Guard for the United States called the Special Operations Command, SOCOM. Special Operations Command is some 70,000 elite troops, as we say, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, things like this, organized in into what are essentially death squads and sent around the world, now active by their own account in 130 countries around the world. This is a private army, basically reporting to no one except the National Security Council, the President's National Security Council, that's kidnapping and killing people around the world. Now, of course, they're after terrorists, right? I mean, this is part of the war on terror. But what they're doing in these 130 countries is terrorizing locals at the command of the President of the United States. It's an amazing situation, a situation, as I say, is only slowly, I think, growing, coming to our awareness. The film Dirty Wars picks it up. Nick Turse has written well about it recently. Several others are now. But this may indeed be one of the most important long-term effects of the Obama administration's attempt to deal with the war.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that these are military people, essentially, but they are transferred nominally to the CIA when it's necessary to do that to maintain secrecy.
Actually, Special Operations Command is now an independent operation, and one of the things that's happening here is that they're arguing with the CIA over who gets to kill people in various places, including the drone program, but other aspects as well. So,
and what about Blackwater?
The CIA is militarized, and SOCOM is secretized, and between the two of them, we have our own sort of SS ready to work around the world, and that's going on whether we know it or not. It's not under any democratic control.
This does make people think of the Waffen-SS, but
exactly.
What about okay, Blackwater? They're under a different name now, and I know they moved to their headquarters to Dubai. Are they still operating?
Not the mercenaries like Blackwater are very much part of it, and they're operating in along with the Special Operations Command and the CIA.
Right. There, I've forgotten there.
Yeah.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 4th week of 2014, a Casual Slaughters edition. If our program has interested you, you might want to look for similar programs here on Urbana Public Television, now not only on cable, but streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight on News from Neptune have been Karen Aram and Ron Zook. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and on our Facebook page, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to you, PTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come endures in my discharge. Meanwhile, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.